Hello and welcome to Debating Russia, a new political discussion program here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. In this edition of the program, we have a look at Russia's political opposition. A year and a half ago, it appeared to be going somewhere. It seemed to have some kind of traction, even maybe some ideas. Today, that doesn't seem to be the case, though members of the opposition, the so-called leadership of the opposition, are calling for more demonstrations, street demonstrations, starting next month. So we'll see where that goes. Okay, to hash this out and more, I'm joined in London with Kadri Leak. She is a senior policy fellow and head of program at European Council on Foreign Relations. And we have Tamila Lankina. She is a senior lecturer, Department of International Relations, London School of Economics. And joining me here in Moscow in our studio here at Voice of Russia is Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst for the Voice of Russia Radio. Since you're sitting next to me, Dima, I'll let you go first. How would you sum up the condition of Russia's political opposition now?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's in a very good shape. And the reason I think these are not so-called political repressions, but the lack of ideas. And also the other problem I think that stems from the protests of 2012 is the fact that you actually have incompatible political actors inside the Russian
So you're saying leadership?
Opposition. Well, not only in the leadership, but even at the grassroots level, when you see liberals marching next to communists, and then next to them you have Mr. Domushkin's nationalists. These are people who actually accuse the government of the same things that their partners, that their coalition partners propose. I mean, the Russian liberals accuse Putin of being nationalist or even a communist. Communists accuse him of being a liberal. And basically, nationalists accuse Putin of being a liberal and of selling the country to foreigners. So when you have people with such diametrically opposed views inside the same movement, you are going to have problems at some moment.
Okay. Kadri, you just heard what Dmitry Babich had to say. How would you react to that?
I think Dmitry's diagnosis is correct, but I wouldn't characterize the situation as in such bleak terms. I think what is important and what needs to be kept in mind is that the constituency for opposition is there and likely to stay. They probably won't be coming to the streets because there is no acute political process, no acute cause to go to the streets. But I sometimes say that the protest has moved from streets into the souls, and it stays there. It can mutate in some ways, but it's not going to disappear. And occasionally you see this readiness to go to the streets again when there is a cause, such as the anti-Magnitsky law recently that drew thousands of people to the streets. And obviously what unites the opposition is opposition to the political system that can be called managed democracy and little else.
Yeah, but what, can you give us some numbers? I mean, there's public opinion polls here. Some people like them, some people don't. What numbers are we talking about here? 5%, 8%, 10% of the population?
I think we should discuss society and opposition leaders separately. Maybe not many people will support the concrete leaders because they don't see them as engaging in serious political process, which probably they don't. But dissatisfaction among the people is still fairly high, and that encompasses multiple groups in the society. It's not just urbanite intellectuals, but very much wider. So that is a serious thing, actually. And I think really the oppositionary mood might outlive its current crop of leaders. I wouldn't be surprised to see that when at one point opposition materializes into something more tangible, it will be doing so being led by completely new faces whom we just don't know yet.
Camilla, you want to jump in there? How do you see the state of Russia's political opposition right now?
I would agree with Kadri's assessment. First of all, I think we have to be clear what we mean by opposition, because within the opposition, clearly there are groups of left-leaning orientation, right-wing groups, the so-called systemic opposition that works or wants to work outside of the system. But there's also civil society and the wider society. And as Kadri mentioned, the kind of social constituencies and the protests that we see happening, they could be also construed as opposition. And Peter, you mentioned numbers. I can give you some numbers, because because I'm actually doing research into the protest dynamics, the mass contentious politics in Russia. And actually, in that sense, we are witnessing some interesting trends because the comparable data, if we look at the years 2007, 2009, when we saw the beginnings of the kind of mass upheavals, actually going back even further towards to 2005, the combined numbers that I have for 2 years, to 2007 and to 2009, of people actually coming out on the streets and protesting was about close to half a million combined when we're talking about protests at various levels, municipal in different regions, etc., national level protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg in large cities.
You would still use the word massive.
Mass protests.
I mean,
Some of them admittedly are Pussy Riot style events that have wide resonance, but they're not mass. So the combined figures for people actually doing these kinds of acts are growing, and we're witnessing an interesting tendency there in terms of the actual mass dimension. And that question is separate, of course, from other questions of leadership of the opposition, which will be also raised in this discussion.
Okay, Dima, you want to jump in?
Well, I would agree with Kadri that there is some opposition in the Serbs, but I really don't think that you can provide some exact figures here because, the number of people who are opposed to the education reform in Russia, a vast number of people. You're going to talk about tens of millions, almost all parents, almost all students. And the number of people who actually care about Mr. Magnitsky and the intricacies of the relationship between Mr. Brauda and Mr. Putin. 50,000 in Moscow. The number of them who are ready to go to the street to say that they like Mr. Brauda and they dislike Putin. Maybe 10,000, not more. So when you talk about opposition, I think you have to be very clear what kind of dissatisfaction, what kind of change do you want? You can be opposed to the education reform and still be a supporter of United Russia. There's a lot of people in United Russia who hate what the Russian Higher School of Economics is doing, if we're talking about schools of economics here, who hate the healthcare reform in Russia, which actually makes it very difficult for a person to get free medical treatment. But people now start to understand that you have this just about in every country of the world now. So Russia is not an exception.
And every pensioner is not happy with their pension.
Yeah, so there are various patterns of thinking. My pattern of thinking is that I'm opposed to a lot of things that the government is doing, but I realize that it's not just ugly Russia doing something that no other country is doing. I think that
that's a very good point.
If I could go back to lots of countries doing bad things, and I'm opposed to them here. I'm opposed to them in the Great Britain, for example.
Dima brings up a good point. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction everywhere right now. I mean, this is a manifestation of just the politics of globalization.
Yeah, that is true. And in some ways, Russia really is in tune with the rest of the world. Also, we talked about opposition leaders. Well, Arab revolutions were largely leaderless. I found this an extremely interesting phenomena. And of course, they are a hard time, thanks to that, now sorting it all out once they have overthrown the regime. But the sort of lack of charismatic leaders really anywhere, that's a contemporary phenomenon that is visible everywhere. It's true. But still, I think kind of relationship between the powers that be and the society is more complicated in Russia than in many other countries. In many other countries, still you see your government as being helpless in the winds of global economic crisis, not quite knowing what to do, being disoriented because so many things are changing at the same time, etc. But in Russia, there is still this feeling that they are manipulating with us. They don't treat us as decent adults who have right to their own opinion. Plus the whole corruption thing, of course, is what people notice on different levels. Some people would notice it on a very local level, very concrete cases. Others make bigger generalizations. So I think there is a special quality to the situation in Russia, which is also not unique to Russia. There are other countries such as well or similar. But still, I wouldn't say it's the same as in the West. It's not.
Can I jump in
well,
there?
I think that this is Dmitry Babich speaking. I'll just say a couple of words to make what I wanted to say more clear. In the West, when people talk about Russian opposition, they usually talk about people who actually agree with the Western perception of Russia, the mainstream Western perception of Russia. So for the West, a real Russian opposition activist is someone who is against anti-Magnitsky law, who thinks that the government is corrupt, and if we introduce Western practices, the government is not going to be corrupt.
Pro-Pussy Riot.
Pro-Pussy Riot, that Russia lags behind the Western world, and if the Western world likes Pussy Riot, then Pussy Riot must have said something sensible. Yeah. And this is not the case. There are lots of people in Russia who are opposed to the government, but who don't fit that pattern.
Okay, Tamila,
exactly,
go ahead.
And that is very good. I mean, Dmitry, what you were describing, it's correct about some people, but it's a really very primitive attitude. And I think people who actually follow Russia know that it's much more complicated, but much more interesting and much more promising than that. And I sometimes have had debates with my Russian liberal friends, exactly the type you are describing. And they say that there is anti-Western liberalism emerging in Russia, which they sometimes see as a bad thing, saying that, our liberals don't see West as a role model anymore. I think it's absolutely good, because that makes liberalism a homegrown concept in Russia, rather than something that is imported from the West or seen by many people as imposed by the West. So I think, these dilemmas are outdated. The West basically is not part of the game. It's what's happening in Russia. It's what Russian people expect from their government what matters, and that will constitute opposition. And West has to adapt to it.
Okay, I have to jump in here. This is Voice of Russia, and you're listening to Debating Russia. Dima, go ahead.
Well, I would agree with what you say, Tamila, but only partially, because the West is very much there, because we live on the same planet, and Russia is no longer a closed state as it used to be under the Soviet Union. And I would say that, let's be frank about it, I talk to a lot of opposition activists. They do get money from the West. And I wouldn't object to it, although it's illegal, but there are lots of things that happen in today's world which are illegal but inevitable. Okay, like some Arabs having 2 wives, although they're French citizens. Okay, this is the way life is. My objection to it is that because of this Western money, which is usually distributed between several people, or rather limited circle of people, the opposition parties don't change. Let me give you an example of Mr. Grigory Yavlinsky. I think he was a great political leader in 1990 when he first emerged on political stage in Russia. But I think that if there was no outside involvement, he would have been gone in 1994. And that would be good for him, that would be good for the party. He would be somewhere now in some kind of a council of Yabloko, in some kind of a central committee, whatever. But there would be other people actually steering the party, new faces. And what we have is just the same person heading the party for 20 years now. You might not know it, but today we have the 20th anniversary of Yabloko's foundation. And Mr. Brezhnev ruled the Soviet Union for 18 years, 2 years less than Mr. Yavlinsky. Well, on the surface of things, he left, but then he returned during the presidential election.
Who wants to jump in here?
So that's my view.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's actually to
Tamila, jump in. Go ahead.
I think it's actually to the credit of parties like Yabloko that they have managed to survive despite the rather adverse and peculiar kind of political context in which political parties operate in Russia. I mean, there are well-known instances of electoral pressures, manipulation, the use of administrative resource at all levels of power in Russia, municipal, regional, federal elections.
And that's why Yabloko doesn't win elections, right? Is that what you're saying? That's why Yabloko doesn't win elections?
There is, the reasons are complex, but asymmetric access
maybe they're not
mass
popular.
Media.
Maybe their platform isn't popular.
That might be. I'm not denying that this is another factor that perhaps might come into play, but clearly other contextual factors like the obstacles that are being placed that these parties face in the electoral process, it doesn't help with the
But now the threshold has been lowered for more and more parties can come into being. They've lowered the threshold.
Parties also had problems with registration, and the kind of political parties in Russia have to fight so many battles that are incomparable to what parties would have to do in a Western democratic context. So in that case, clearly a lot of their energies go towards, battling issues like have we got enough allegations of forged signatures, etc., during elections. So, of course, this takes...
I agree with you. I agree with you. I don't think that what you say contradicts to what I said. Indeed, parties had lots of problems in Russia. But the fact that the same person heads the party for 20 years certainly doesn't help. And, the established parties, Yabloko belongs to the so-called circle of established parties. It has been on the stage for 20 years. They actually profited from the situation that we had for 5 years when it was very difficult to register a new party because it sort of lowered the competition. But what I was talking about was that, liberalism or democracy or whatever in Russia, it cannot be completely homegrown. It should be homegrown, but it cannot be completely homegrown simply because we live in an open world now. And frankly, I don't think it's possible for the government to prevent foreign financing because you know how things are done now. You transfer money to my credit card, I transfer it to your credit card. It's not like in the Soviet times when you had to smuggle dollars and face 20 years in jail for smuggling dollars. Now you just push a button and the money goes. And my point is that I don't want to say that Yabloko is a bad party. I think that Yabloko should have different leaders. There should be a change of generations. And it doesn't occur.
Okay, I want to remind our listeners here that you're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle, and this is our new weekly discussion program, Debating Russian. Okay, Kadir, and one of the things that my Russian friends say, liberal and non-liberal, is that it's really a competition among egos in the opposition, and it really turns them off, because I think all of us in the program here would agree change is necessary, political progression is necessary, always is necessary everywhere, but it gets down to these familiar faces, and it's a real turnoff here. How do you get around that? How do you change that?
That's a good question. I wish I had an answer, but I think, Yabloko. I don't really think Western money matters a great deal in the big picture. Whether or not they get it, I have no data about it. But I think why Yabloko is not popular, it failed to cut certain deals with the Kremlin at some point. Then the Kremlin propaganda machine would have worked in their favor and they would be pretty popular. As popular as allowed. But that said, I think opposition... Currently still, I think all political forces, be it opposition or be it United Russia, are products of a system of managed democracy. They operate within the framework of that system. And no one yet has managed to start a process of dismantling the system, profoundly changing the system.
Well, maybe the answer is to go around it. Tamil, if I can go to you, the thing is that when I look at these street protests, and I went to almost every single one of them, and I would talk with different people, and I'd say, opposition, changing a system is a lot of hard work. It takes years.
Absolutely.
And going after just power is not the answer. It's civil society, it's been mentioned here before.
Exactly.
I lived in Poland during the Solidarity period, and the thing was, don't go for power because that's theirs, okay?
Yeah.
But you have to develop a more vibrant political society among yourselves. And
Exactly.
Kim and I have gone to these protests, and you see all these people. I don't want to stand next to this guy because he looks like a Nazi. Okay?
And that's what
and
we're
the guy
witnessing.
On the other side looks like a Bolshevik. Okay.
What we are witnessing now is, you're right, there is a greater activism in terms of civil society participation, and also mass protests is a way of non-institutionalized forms of political participation. Even in healthy democracies, we have non-institutionalized forms of participation, such as contentious politics, in addition to institutionalized forms of participation, such as voting and influencing your MP, liaising with your local representatives, etc. These kinds of forms of institutionalized institutionalized democratic accountability. And even in established democracies, you have street protests, particularly when citizens feel that they cannot influence the establishment or political regime, policies, and governance. This is when people go out in the streets. Now, these people don't necessarily want to become part of the system or join the government. They're simply they're simply using alternative ways of influencing the political establishment. And in Russia, we are witnessing these kind of dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, they are separate from issues of political opposition, divisions, or whether there is a coherent ideology or not. So, and in my view, that's quite a positive thing, because the numbers I'm looking at for my research on protests include specifically civil society activism, people going out on the streets in their neighborhood protesting against illegal construction, for example, or environmental issues. And we're seeing more and more people joining. So in terms of the actual numbers of people who are joining in these protests and perhaps incrementally influencing politics at very local levels. And these protests often don't get any coverage. I mean, you won't hear about them on the BBC or CNN, but in my view, these are the kind of trends that we all have to be watching and observing. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves like the Middle Eastern experts who did not predict or anticipate the Middle Eastern uprisings, because they were not closely watching the underlying trends that are hidden from the public eye, that are not subject to close mainstream media scrutiny. So I think that's what we really should be looking at, rather than the kind of stuff that gets media attention, that, that's off, what did he do, or, what did Yavlinsky do?
That's exactly true. Sort of that's exactly true. And that's what we have been talking about. And, just to sum it up, I think that basically Yavlinsky did have the support of the Kremlin at some point. I don't know how old you are, but I have been watching Russian politics since 1990. In 1995, in 1997, there was a joke that when you switch on your iron to iron your clothes, Yavlinsky is speaking from there. He had a lot of he was exposed to the media. There was such a period, but he never went beyond a certain ceiling that he had, people who believed him. And that's the problem with charismatic leaders who stay too long. A lot of people are talking about Putin staying in the spotlight too long. But there is also the same problem with the opposition guys.
Yeah,
and
I
would say that they have the same authoritarian trends sometimes. We need change in the opposition.
Are we just talking about Yabloko party or the opposition in general?
I think it's wrong
I'm surprised
to focus
that Yabloko got a lot more
on
airtime than I expected. A lot more airtime than I expected. Okay. I'm sorry, who wants to jump in?
Yeah, Kadri here. I really don't think we ought to focus on Yabloko far too much, because it's a complex story, and it has to do with this larger-than-life figure of Boris Yeltsin that dominated the Russian scene throughout 1990s. And before that, he was the kind of opposition leader, and everyone else had dilemmas whether to join him, try to influence him, or go against him, and they never solved these dilemmas in a satisfactory manner. So that's a separate story. But the situation now, I'm old enough to remember the upheavals of the late 80s, early 90s, and the situation now reminds me of Estonia, and this is where I come from. I know very well this country, of Estonia in 1987. Back then, people also could say that, well, if you don't like the communist leaders of Estonia, then you must like, and they would name sort of lonely, odd figures of dissidents whose names were known thanks to Voice of America, etc., but whom people sort of respected and feared. I mean, people don't want to follow leaders whose path goes through jails. But it took just 1 year, and some intra-systemic people or state-okay people joining the opposition. And you had all singing revolution, and the leaders of that were the future leaders of the country.
It's interesting. I lived in Poland during the 1980s, and I can understand where you're coming from. But and I've lived now here in Russia for 15 years, and there's one thing I've noticed the entire time, is that nobody I talk to wants any sudden change because of the memory of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 1990s. The 1990s in Russia is akin to the Great Depression in the West during the 1930s. And this is one thing that I sense all of the time. I sense people do want to change. I do sense also that a lot of people don't feel like they're represented in government, okay? Not that they're disenfranchised, it's just that their voice doesn't count as much, okay? Tamila,
I just wanted to just...
We're almost out of time here. Go ahead, jump in. I was just going to talk about the electoral process.
In terms of popular preferences, as we know, they're often shaped by mainstream television, which in Russia, as we know, is controlled. So even public opinion surveys are not always representative of what people actually think, because questions might be phrased in certain ways, but also because the media shapes public opinion. So, and I would disagree that everybody in Russia thinks, most people that do not support radical change. I would.
Well, I mean, a revolution or something like that. I think there is really no constituency for that now. Okay.
We're not talking about revolution, but a change of the regime, which could happen peacefully through the electoral process if the opposition were allowed to function.
The opposition can't win elections. That's the problem. They can't win.
Well, in context when they face administrative hurdles.
If you look at most public opinion polls before the last election, the public opinion polls before the election count and after the polls more or less were in line. There were some discrepancies in some places, but more or less in line.
Because
this is one of the things I really find...
Yeah. No, but that was a manipulated landscape. And basically the opposition didn't manage to structure. And I mean, the opposition in the society didn't have time to... basically manifest itself in coherent political movement. So all they had were the same old opposition leaders who didn't manage to decide how to...
Is that the fault of the political establishment or the opposition, or both?
Both. I mean, it's a manipulated system. And the opposition realized very late in the day that they actually existed and that there was some power behind them. So there was no time for that internal restructuring and mobilization.
But 500,000 people, let's say 500,000 people, can that change the political system in Russia? Is that the majority?
I think there is majority much bigger than that. I mean, these are the people who have come out on the streets, but I mean, there are so many people who are simply stay in their kitchens and discuss.
I would agree. Sorry, this is Tamila jumping in. I would agree that there are both internal aspects to the opposition as well as the external environmental context that shapes their low levels of success. So internal factors would be leadership issues, perhaps lack of a leader that would represent all these disparate groups. And the external environment is obviously the administrative and other hurdles that they face, and not to mention pressures and in some cases arrests. And those two are interrelated in terms of how much support these parties and other groupings get from the mass citizens. If over time it becomes clear that their electoral chances are limited because of these external hurdles that they face, the citizenry also loses faith in this electoral process.
And that we've seen a lot of election reform since the last election. The ability to form a political party is so much easier right now. Registration is easier right now. Of course, we have to wait for the next election to see how it pans out.
Exactly.
All right, I'm sorry we've run out of time here. Fascinating discussion, and I hope we'll be able to discuss it again. I want to thank my guests here, Kadri Tamila and Dmitry Babic here in Moscow.
Thank you very much for
tuning in to Debating Russia. Stay with Voice of Russia.
Yet.
Camilla, you want to jump in there? How do you see the state of Russia's political opposition right now?
I would agree with Kadri's assessment. First of all, I think we have to be clear what we mean by opposition, because within the opposition, clearly there are groups of left-leaning orientation, right-wing groups, the so-called systemic opposition that works or wants to work outside of the system. But there's also civil society and the wider society. And as Kadri mentioned, the kind of social constituencies and the protests that we see happening, they could be also construed as opposition. And Peter, you mentioned numbers. I can give you some numbers, because I'm actually doing research into the protest dynamics, the mass contentious politics in Russia. And actually, in that sense, we are witnessing some interesting trends because the comparable data, if we look at the years 2007, 2009, when we saw the beginnings of the kind of mass upheavals, actually going back even further towards to 2005, the combined numbers that I have.
Selling the country to foreigners. So when you have people with such diametrically opposed views inside the same movement, you are going to have problems at some moment.
Okay. Kadri, you just heard what Dmitry Babic had to say. How would you react to that?
I think Dmitry's diagnosis is correct, but I wouldn't characterize the situation as in such bleak terms. I think what is important and what needs to be kept in mind is that the constituency for opposition is there and likely to stay. They probably won't be coming to the streets because there is no acute political process, no acute cause to go to the streets. But I sometimes say that the protest has moved from streets into the souls, and it stays there. It can mutate in some ways, but it's not going to disappear. And occasionally you see this readiness to go to the streets again when there is a cause, such as the anti-Magnitsky law recently that drew thousands of people to the streets. And obviously what unites the opposition is opposition to the...
Hello and welcome to Debating Russia, a new political discussion program here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. In this edition of the program, we have a look at Russia's political opposition. A year and a half ago, it appeared to be going somewhere. It seemed to have some kind of traction, even maybe some ideas. Today, that doesn't seem to be the case, though members of the opposition, the so-called leadership of the opposition, are calling for more demonstrations, street demonstrations, starting next month. So we'll see where that goes. Okay, to hash this out and more, I'm joined in London with Kadri Leak. She is a senior policy fellow and head of program at European Council on Foreign Relations. And we have Tamila Lankina. She is a senior lecturer, Department of International Relations, London School of Economics. And joining me here in Moscow in our studio here at Voice of Russia is Dmitry Babic. He's a political analyst for the Voice of Russia Radio. Since you're sitting next to me, Dima, I'll let you go first. How would you sum up the condition of Russia's political opposition now?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's in a very good shape. And the reason, I think, these are not so-called political repressions, but the lack of ideas. And also the other problem, I think, that stems from the protests of 2012 is the fact that you actually have incompatible political actors inside the Russian.
So you're saying leadership?
Opposition. Well, not only in the leadership, but even at the grassroots level, when you see liberals marching next to communists, and then next to them you have Mr. Domushkin's nationalists. These are people who actually accuse the government of the same things that their partners, that their coalition partners propose. I mean, the Russian liberals accuse Putin of being nationalist or even a communist. Communists accuse him of being a liberal. And basically, nationalists accuse Putin of being a liberal and of...
a political system that can be called managed democracy and little else.
Yeah, but what, can you give us some numbers? I mean, there's public opinion polls here. Some people like them, some people don't. What numbers are we talking about here? 5%, 8%, 10% of the population?
I think we should discuss society and opposition leaders separately. Maybe not many people will support the concrete leaders because they don't see them as engaging in serious political process, which probably they don't. But dissatisfaction among the people is still fairly high, and that encompasses multiple groups in the society. It's not just urbanite intellectuals, but very much wider. So that is a serious thing, actually. And I think really the oppositionary mood might outlive its current crop of leaders. I wouldn't be surprised to see that when at one point opposition materializes into something more tangible, it will be doing so being led by completely new faces whom we just don't know.